And joining me now here on set is the Superintendent of Vancouver Public Schools, Dr. Jeff Snell. Dr. Snell, thank you so much for your time and for joining me here today.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, and welcome to the Rapids Report. I want to get started right on the issue at hand. If you can, talk about the factors that culminated in the current budget cuts that are now affecting schools across our district. In your view, which of those factors are most significant?
Yeah, this is a conversation I've been having a lot over the last several years, and it's something that's not specific to Vancouver, too. So when I talk about these are factors that other districts are experiencing as well. So the first one is just around the staffing costs of running a school district. Your teaching staff, your administrative staff, your classified staff, all those people play a really important role in delivering the services and experiences that students want and their community expects. And over the last several years, the cost of staff has increased. And I want to say, that's important because our staff deserves the compensation that they receive. They're very good. We want to attract and retain high quality staff, and our board of directors want to do that. Unfortunately, what we're funded from the state for that staffing hasn't kept pace. And so the gap between the funding that we receive and the cost of staff has increased pretty significantly since about 2018-19. That was a really important year because of a Supreme Court decision in the state of Washington that kind of recalibrated how funding was done. And unfortunately, since that decision, we were as close as we've ever been in terms of the funding received and the cost, and it's spread since that time. And so we're a really large employer. I think we're the second largest employer in the region. And when you're employing staff, and you're a nonprofit or a school district like us, you don't necessarily can't raise the cost of what you're selling or anything like that. You're pretty much locked into whatever revenues are driving your budget. And for us, the biggest part is state. And so that's been a challenge. We've seen that challenge coming for a while, and it's pretty cyclical for school districts. And so it's why other districts are experiencing it as well. So that's a really important factor. There's two others that I would want to talk about. One is special education funding. So special education is for any student that qualifies for services, and there's a condition, a diagnosis, those kinds of things, and a team comes together to determine if a student should receive those services. Those are required by law, both federally and state. And unfortunately, we've had quite a gap in between what it actually costs to provide those services and the revenue that we receive from that. And so, last year, that was more than $10 million gap. So that's a really big cost that we're trying to deal with at a district level. And then the third factor is the non-employee kinds of things, like insurance, like gas, utilities, those kinds of things. And we've seen those increases not just in public education, but across all sectors the last several years. Those costs have gone up pretty quickly. And again, not keeping up with the revenue that comes to support that. So of those three, probably special education and staffing are the two largest parts of our deficit. And I would probably call those out as the ones that are the ones that we're paying most attention. Yeah, and really trying to advocate for change around those.
Yeah, on the district level, when it comes to determining which programs were being cut or maintained, what did the district's process look like?
Yeah, so first, through COVID, the federal government deployed resources called kind of pandemic relief dollars. They had lots of different acronyms, but basically they were funding not just to school districts, but a lot of different entities, even small business and things like that, to try to offset the impact of the pandemic. And so we were able to use those funds to kind of hold our positions and not make reductions for a couple of years, which is pretty significant. Some of our neighboring districts weren't able to do that. And so an Evergreen school district went through this process a couple of years before us. During that time when we're holding off on that, then the other part of that is just trying to figure out, you mentioned programming. So our school board didn't want to impact programming per se. Now, when you're going to cut 9 to 10%, it's really hard to to not impact programs. And so what happened is when we look at our staffing model, we looked at all the different groups of employees that we have. And our largest group, probably not surprisingly, is our teachers, because that's our direct service. And so looking at the reductions at all those levels, but at a point where it's not going to like close the IB program or something like that. Now, is it going to make it harder? Yeah. Is it going to like make classes go up? Yeah. But can we still keep offering classes and really try to buy time to see if there's options to continue those, right, with new revenue? The other thing, I've been doing this now for a while, and it's very cyclical. As I said before, like the state has these 2-year cycles where the legislator approves another budget. And so a lot of times it's trying to get to the next biennium to see if those revenues are going to come in to offset some of the challenges that you have in your budget.
And for, I think, a lot of students and teachers really in this school and across the district, I think there was a sense that they've been hit really hard by these last budget cuts. So in your role as the superintendent, what do you believe your role looks like in maintaining the morale of both these teachers and students during these financially difficult times? And how have you and other district leaders helped to manage that emotional impact, both on the students and then on the parents of those students?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, right? And probably one that I'm always learning on how to do that, right? I think throughout my leadership, I've always recognized the power of hope and also the power of like student voice and really trying to recenter. Whether it was as a principal, as a math teacher, as a superintendent, recenter our work around like why do we do this and how fortunate are we to get to work with students. We're not the only organization that's had to go through budget reductions, right? Pretty much any service kind of industry has had to kind of revamp and redefine who they are after the pandemic. But when we're working with students and families, like it just feels really, really impactful. And so some of the things that I try to think about in my leadership is just trying to be consistent. And so over the course of the budget process, like we have these things called All Staff Connects, where it's like a staff meeting for everybody via Zoom. And so really try to share information consistently with our staff, even years before the reduction, talking about it and what's going to happen with it. The other piece is I always try to like bring student voice back into the conversation, and so like each week I send out an email to all of our staff and really try to center us on, this year my theme when I interview students is just ask who's helped you and tell me about that. It's pretty amazing to hear students talk about the impact. And is it harder to have an impact when you've cut almost 250 positions across the district? Yes. But does it mean you can't still have an impact? No, right? So just trying to keep us focused on the opportunities that we have. I think part of the criticism sometime in my leadership is I have been too hopeful sometimes. Like people are like, don't give me that anymore, right? This is horrible, and it is, and I always want to acknowledge that. And yet, what do we do with it? Kind of thing is where I try to kind of find energy and help people move forward. So most of my job is meeting with people and trying to help them. And I would say the most frustrating part of my job is there's never enough resources to go around to help everybody. And that was the case when I was a math teacher. Like I felt like, man, I wish I could give more time or I could help. It was the case as a principal. It was the case as a superintendent. And so I think the more you can listen, the more you can be authentic and real and try to like not pretend like you have all the answers. Like I think the better off you're going to be in the long run.
I do want to bring up a recent decision that the district made, which a lot of students and staff, I think, were very critical of. After nearly a decade of covering the costs of IB and AP exams for students district-wide, the district announced in early September that it would no longer pay for those costs for most students. Many parents and teachers have since voiced their criticism that the announcement came too late. Why wasn't this decision announced or perhaps made earlier when the other costs and budgeting decisions were made back in the spring?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think anytime you're going to change something that happens, your communication plan around what that looks like is always really important. And I think you can always learn from however that rolls out or whatever that looks like. So, you know, the timeliness of it, I think some people were frustrated about it. I think when we look at what we were communicating in the spring, most of our focus was on staff decisions and, you know, lots of energy around courses that we're trying to continue to roll and run, those kinds of things. So I think the next layer was looking at like these kinds of potential savings. The challenge with like AP, IB, college in the classroom, one is like the state is starting to fund more college in the classroom kinds of experiences. So when we look at how do we make our dollars go as far as they can for kids' impact, you know, those are areas that have expanded since the practice was to kind of cover the cost of all AP and IB. And then the other thing that stood out about our practice compared to other districts is we covered the cost for everybody, regardless of need. And that's not a practice that's common in other districts. If there is a need, then covering those costs is a common practice. And that's something, too, that in rolling it out in September, trying to be really clear that like we're not wanting to police who has need or not. We just need to know if people have need, and then we're going to cover those costs for them. But in general, when we look at all the reductions across the board and all the different activities that we have, like continuing to like subsidize that for everyone was going to be something that we weren't going to be able to continue for the long term. So that's kind of how it all factored into the...
Why was the decision made during that time period when the staffing decisions were announced?
No, not during the staffing time. Most of the energy from probably until the end of May was focused on staff and meeting with all the impacted staff and trying to determine, one, if we can place them again, two, just trying to honor where they're at and the dignity of like having somebody tell you that you're losing your job. And so really when we started to go to the next layer of decisions was late in the school year. And part of the challenge is like knowing when people are going to be ready to receive the communication. Our experience is usually at the end of the school year, people are kind of moving on. And so thinking about the September time was, you know, trying to figure out when we have everybody that's going to be there, be back, be going to the school year. Again, I think we can always do things differently and better, right? In hindsight, you can always look at stuff, and you should always look at decisions that were made and plans that were put into place and how you can do better by that. But I think ultimately also feeling like, you know, we're going to support anybody that has a need. So like, you know, certainly not letting anybody be out there with a cost that they can't support in a program that they thought was going to happen. You know, that shouldn't be the case for anybody. If there's a need, then just need to let us know so that we can figure out how to cover that cost. There's also a hope that we can find funding for those kinds of things too, right? So like we had to limit the elementary skilleries. So we used to have like track and like a volleyball, and we're only able to do track this year. But there's also a hope, like, can we find a grant? Can we do something to kind of make that happen? And so there is a little bit of like, can we wait and see if there's a solution? And sometimes when you do that and there isn't a solution, it can feel like you're kind of late to the communication too.
As far as the timeline when that decision was ultimately announced in September, you know, seniors here at River were already enrolled in classes. How would you respond to those students and then teachers of those IB classes who feel that the district's decision was unfair in the sense that it, you know, is affecting these students who were already invested in this program and had already enrolled in those classes by that point in September?
Yeah, I think if it impacted them individually, I would just apologize to them that had that impact, right? I think we always need to own the outcomes of what we're trying to do. I think it's not unlike lots of other conversations I've had around the district that people are invested in something and it's changed. I think it's a real challenge when you have to reduce a budget that big that you're going to have these impacts that, you know, our school board certainly doesn't want. Nobody wants that. You know, nobody wants classes larger. You know, all those things. And I think when you go through that process, like there are also places where you think you might have the communication where it needs to be, and then it turns out you didn't, right? And so you just need to think about that and figure out in the next, you know, hopefully we don't have reductions of that level again, but I'm not necessarily seeing solutions from the state at this point. And so, if we're at a point in 5 years from now where we have to talk about closing schools because they're too small, or we have to think about consolidating programs, all these are like experiences that hopefully allow us to do that better as we move forward. I also know that whenever you're making these kinds of decisions, sometimes regardless of the communication, people are going to be unhappy because they disagree with the decision, and I understand that and appreciate that. And that's because it's hard, right? If it wasn't hard, then it probably we didn't have the need for it in the beginning. And I felt like with all these budget reductions, like we have needed that staff. We have needed these opportunities. And so that's the part that just like, I didn't get into this work to take things away, right? I get into this work to try to help, and so that's the part that's really challenging.
If the decision was announced near the end of the last school year, as I'm picking up, would you have gone back in time, and would you have announced that decision earlier, or do you stand by the timing of when?
I think anybody that says I stand by whatever isn't thoughtful about. Anytime somebody has an experience that isn't what you wanted, then I'm always thinking about, well, how could we do that differently, right? So, I mean, given that, certainly this is an item that River has attention, this is not an item that I hear about across the district, right? There's other items I hear about more frequently, but understanding that and appreciating that, like, I think there's always room to do things better, right? So whether it's announcing it in the spring or having a different way of rolling it out, I feel like a lot of energy in this particular one was around, like, I don't have this covered anymore. And in our intention, it was like, no, like anybody that has a need, we're going to figure this out for you. We just can't go across the board and just cover this for everybody when we're eliminating all these other, positions and programming, like the elementary skillery kinds of things that I mentioned. So that part, it feels like there was, we didn't get that message out clear enough to people because people kept like, I can't afford this, or, this isn't, well, then we'll try to help you, right? So, yeah.
And then for IB and AP exams across the district, they had been really covered for, I think, nearly a decade. Are there any plans to reinstate funding for those exams, among other affected programs which you mentioned, if financial conditions improve in the future? And then if that's not something that's feasible, what measures, if any, is the district considering to help offset that financial burden which you bring up?
So one thing, as I mentioned, college in the classroom, so it's also paying attention to what the state's funding, right? Like, and so if there's more options for kids to take University of Washington classes at high school and get college credit for it, then that's something as a district we need to be thoughtful about, right? Like if we don't have enough resources for everything. Obviously IB is very specific to the program here, so we need to be mindful of that too, and how can we support that? I don't, like as I mentioned, we were an outlier in terms of paying for everybody's fees with that. And so I don't necessarily see going back to the old practice. I do see, and we will continue in what we're doing right now, is if there is a financial need, covering those costs, because there shouldn't be a student that isn't able to benefit from the programming if they don't have the ability to pay for it. And that would be similar to what we do with, like if you're wanting to go out for cross country or whatever else, other opportunity in the district, the finance part should not be a burden for our students that they can't participate. And sometimes that's easier said, like when it's transportation issues or other things like that that are a little more maybe complex than a fee, but that's always our goal.
Yeah, I do want to turn up to something that you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
Some prominent IB teachers here at River have raised concerns about what they describe as the potential, quote, phasing out of the IB program. How would you like to address those fears, and can you provide any assurance or insight into the district's commitment to maintaining what they describe as the rigorous IB program?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, and also one that I get at other schools as well when we're talking about the reductions and whatever specific program that they're working on. I think for us in general, like it's always important to have students enrolled in the classes and wanting to take that as a pathway or an option. And so through the years, we've had different pathways that have come and gone. There's no like, hey, let's let's phase out IB or anything like that, but it is sometimes dependent on what students sign up for and what they're interested in. And so that is something that's always a factor for every program, has been and will be moving forward. I think specifically the school board's commitment to IB is reflected in some of the class sizes here at Columbia River. Because in order to offer and continue the program, we need to provide some classes that aren't as full as other classes, but the board's committed to seeing that through. And that's not easy, because there's a lot of pressure. Pretty much at every school board meeting, somebody talks about like the size of classes. Just last night, somebody did, and so there's pressure on people to say, well, it'd be easier if we didn't have those classes, and then we could have, a few less in each other class and balance those out. But the board wants to make sure that pathway is available for students, and supported it through the staffing model last year, and I see them supporting that in the future too.
Yeah, so you can say at this time that the district is committed to maintaining the IB program?
Yeah, I think I could say that they're committed to all the programs that we have in our district, because the direction I received through the budget reduction process is that they didn't want to eliminate anything. I think what school board directors learn is through the years it's really hard to start something, and once you start it, like if you just stop it, like to bring it back is really, really difficult. And so I think there's a commitment from the school board to not affect any of that programming. And I think there's a desire to expand programming if possible. So I think we're very fortunate to have the school board that we do that's really focused on trying to support students, and they really believe in the different types of programming that we offer.
Back in March, you were invited to attend a student-led protest over the impact of those initial budget cuts announced in the spring here at River and across the district. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of protests like that one?
Well, first of all, I got to meet you at that, right? I think any chance that we have to meet and talk about concerns and fears and priorities is always really important. I was proud of our students. This affects them, and I saw a lot of involvement and care. I saw a lot of commitment to their staff, which is super awesome to see, right? Because that's what you want. You want students and staff that really care deeply about each other, and that's what I heard. I think my job as superintendent is always to carry. I feel like I'm carrying people's voice with me all the time, and trying to find the appropriate places within our community to leverage that voice to benefit the students that we serve. And so every experience I have, this interview, those protests, right, I'm just trying to listen and think about, how is this affecting people? Next week I have a presentation to a community organization called Rotary, right? These are a bunch of mostly retired people in the community that care deeply about it. I always try to carry voice to them to make them understand the impact of some of these things, and hopefully have them advocate on behalf of public education and the students in our community. So those were all really powerful experiences. I think one was really telling for me because I was principal at Fort Vancouver, and so when you're a principal at a school, you never stop being principal at that school. It's really near and dear to your heart. And so to meet with the students at Fort and to hear their frustration, it really felt like I had went full circle. Here I was their advocate at Fort, and now I'm a part of removing staff from them, right? That was just it was kind of emotional, right? To think about, am I doing the work that I want to be doing? Am I doing enough? All those questions that I think are really important for us always to answer about whatever work we do, right? Are we doing enough? Are we doing the right work? And so I think those student protests really challenged me to continue to think about the work that we do and how we can do it better together.
Yeah, and one of the things you told me in our interview during that protest while that was taking place, you talked about your efforts and the school board's efforts to advocate at the state level for increased funding. I'm wondering if you can elaborate upon that for our viewers now, as well as what you believe, what more needs to be done, and how can the community support those efforts?
Yeah, really good question. I'm glad I said that in the interview. So first, my job is to do outreach first. And so when it's not the legislative session, which is this fall, and before elections, I reach out to candidates and I reach out to people that are currently holding office, and I set up times to meet with them. I leave it up to them, like in person, Zoom, whatever works for you, phone call. Do you want to come see a school? And there's a range of what that looks like. So some do come into our schools. So I hosted some of them this fall in some of our schools. Some of them just respond to the email kind of request, thank you. I help the board identify priorities that they adopt in a legislative platform, and so that happened in October. And so that platform is around special education staffing and the non-staff costs like insurance and utilities that I mentioned to you. And then we use that platform with all of our elected officials as well. And so any conversation we have, we bring that platform forward and we talk about what would help, what wouldn't help. We also do outreach across districts because there's power in people being consistent. So this is the first time I've felt across the state that that's a really unifying message. In my career, it's never been like this. So if you were to go to a different district and ask these same questions, they would tell you special ed, they would tell you insurance, they would tell you staffing, right? And we're trying to be very uniform in that approach so our legislators get a clear message because it's hard for them. I'm sure they have a lot of people that tell them what they should and shouldn't do, and we want to be really consistent with that. We're hosting a legislative forum on Friday as a region, and so I'm the facilitator of that. And we invite as many. Sometimes lots show up, sometimes not many show up. And then once the session starts, I always try to have like an open door where I just check in with legislators because sometimes they'll get like a proposed bill or something and they're not necessarily sure. And I always want them to know that they can call me or they can ask a question and get our perspective. And then I testify on certain bills, either pro, neutral, or against. And that's different now because you can do that via Zoom. So it allows me to kind of still be superintendent and not drive up to Olympia and miss the whole day, and to kind of give my perspective on that. I think you had asked like what other people and what people should know. Yeah. They hear from me all the time. So it's really important to hear from other voices in the community. I think it gets their attention differently. I think the student protests got their attention. Like people asked me about that, and I shared what the energy was, why it was, right? All those things. So the more that if you're passionate about IB test fees, right? Like reach out and advocate. Like maybe that's a bill that all those could be funded across the state. If you're passionate about the student class size ratio or whatever it is, like share. If you're passionate about extracurriculars, right? Take a minute to shoot an email or show up at one of the town halls and let them know. I think a lot of times we as adults make a lot of decisions as what happens to you. Right? And that's based on a lot of experience and hopefully wisdom and thoughtfulness. But you also need a voice in that in terms of what you think is important. So I would encourage people to reach out.
You touched upon this when you were explaining your experience as a principal at Fort Vancouver. In your view, as the superintendent of Vancouver Public Schools, what has been the most difficult part, perhaps for you personally, when dealing with these budget cuts?
Yeah, I met with probably 60 plus teachers that lost their job, individually, and have them tell me about why they should keep their job, and they're really good reasons, right? These are great people that really, they want to do the work, they believe in the work, they formed really strong relationships. Most of those people would say, I'm just worried about my students, we've established this, or we're doing this, and so not being able to say yes to that, that sucked. It just, you want to, as I mentioned earlier, help people, and then you're in this position where it's really difficult to say yes, right? So that's a tough part of the job, but also I have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility. The reason I said yes to this job wasn't because I thought it was easy and there was easy stuff coming. It was because I care about this community. I think I'm a good person that wants to help people. I know there's difficult things, so I'll put myself in there and try to help to the best of my ability, and just kind of move as much as I can in the time and the opportunities I'm given. And if that changes and I'm not given that opportunity, I want to look back and say, like, I did everything I could to make a difference. And there's certainly lots of things I could look back, not just as my superintendent career, but throughout where, I wish I'd have done this, or I wish I'd have taken advantage of that opportunity. I just want to have as minimal of those kinds of reflections as possible, because so many people have poured into me and given me this chance. And so it's like when you ask, like, yeah, of course I'm here. I want to talk to you. I want to learn from you, right? So it's a tough job, and there's things that I'm disappointed about, but I'm also very fortunate that I get a chance to serve in this way for as long as I have. And each day I wake up, I want to be a little better than I was the day before, right? And I really do believe that we can make the world better by being better, each of ourselves, right? Each day with whatever opportunity we have.
And looking back to when those initial budget cuts were first announced, is there any one specific thing that you now think you would have done differently?
I think it's sharing the problem. Like, I tried to, having young adults now who are teenagers, my twins, like, we'd have a lot of these conversations where it would be like I'd be telling something to them, and then all of a sudden they'd say, wait, what? Right? Like, they would pay attention. And I feel like sometimes with these really difficult news, you can talk about it for a couple years. You can say we're using ESSER funds to not make these reductions, but it's really hard to get people's attention. And so, I always think back to how could we have gotten more attention, right? How could we have helped? Because a lot of times people are saying known more, or wish I'd have, and I'm reflecting, man, we were talking about this, right? But it wasn't necessarily capturing people's attention in the same way. And I understand that anytime there's a difficult decision, that's when people will pay attention. So I'm always reflecting back on how did we roll this out? What did this look like, right? So those are always opportunities I feel like I could do better as I reflect on big, complex challenges that I've had the opportunity to navigate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Snell.
Great questions.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Hey Rapids, thanks for helping us reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. If you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the CRTV YouTube channel to support content for and by CR students. Thanks for watching.